Good evening. Thank you all for coming out today. I'm Andrew Farber. I'm the director of the library, and on behalf of the Chappaqua Library, I want to thank you all. It is my honor to introduce Ms. Huma Abedin to discuss her new book, Both and, with us tonight. Ms. Abedin was... Ms. Abedin was born in Kalamazoo, Michigan, and at the age of 2, moved with her family to Jeddah, Saudi Arabia, eventually returning to the United States for college. At George Washington University, she earned a Bachelor of Arts degree as a journalism major with a minor in political science. Ms. Abedin has spent her entire career in public service and national politics, beginning as an intern in First Lady Hillary Clinton's office in 1996. After 4 years in the White House, she worked in the U.S. Senate as senior advisor to Senator Clinton and was traveling chief of staff for Clinton's 2008 presidential campaign. In 2009, she was appointed Deputy Chief of Staff at the U.S. Department of State. She served as the Vice Chair for Hillary for America in 2016, resulting in the first woman-elected nominee of a major political party. She currently serves as the Chief of Staff. She's comfortable in rooms with diplomats and sovereigns, as she is with entrepreneurs, artists, philanthropists, and activists, and has witnessed many crucial moments in the 21st century American history. Ms. Abedin was at Camp David for urgent efforts related to Middle East peace in the waning months of the Clinton administration, Ground Zero in the days after 9/11 attacks, the inauguration of the first African-American president of the United States, and the convention floor when America nominated its first female president candidate. Ms. Abedin's memoir, Both and, A Life in Many Worlds, was published on November 2nd, 2021. The book covers her childhood in Saudi Arabia, her faith, her time as an aide to Clinton, and her relationship with former Democratic representative and former husband. I am also pleased to introduce Dr. Evelyn Farkas, who will conduct tonight's question and answers. Evelyn most recently spoke at the library's Foreign Policy Discussion Group, and we are delighted to once again welcome Evelyn back to discuss Both and with author Huma Abedin. Dr. Farkas has 3 decades of experience working on national security and foreign policy in the U.S. executive, legislative branch, private sector, and for international organizations overseas. In 2019-2020, she ran to represent the New York's 17th Congressional District in the House of Representatives. She is currently president of Farkas Global Strategies. Prior to that, she was senior fellow at the German Marshall Fund of the United States and the Atlantic Council and national security contributor for NBC, MSNBC. From 1997 to 2001, Farkas was professor of international relations at the U.S. Marshall Corps Command and Staff College. She served in 1996-97 in Bosnia with the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. She has published numerous journal articles and opinion pieces on fractured states and U.S. policy, Iraq, Ethiopia, and Bosnia in the 90s. She speaks Hungarian and German and has studied French, Spanish, Serbo-Croatian, Russian, and Hindi. Without taking any more of your time tonight, it is my pleasure to introduce 2 American women who have and continue to further the humanitarian goals of the United States, both at home and abroad. Thank you for coming here this evening. We look forward to what promises to be a thoughtful and powerful discussion.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Thank you to Joan Kuhn for organizing this evening. It's really a distinct pleasure for me to be back in my hometown with Huma Abedin, who, in many ways is special to Chappaqua because of her relationship with President and Secretary Clinton. So it does feel like a homecoming of sorts. And Huma and I, full disclosure, have also intersected. What was, I guess, left out of that ridiculously long bio I have was that we worked together in the U.S. Senate, and then I worked in the Pentagon and you worked in the State Department. So now you have embarked upon a new chapter in your life, writing many chapters for this book, and you write incredibly well. There are sentences in there, that led me to kind of put these little pieces of paper in my book, like my father was told he was dying, so he went out and lived. I mean, it really takes your breath away. It's a page turner, incredibly, because it's a nonfiction book, but it's a page turner, and it's very brave. I mean, you really bare your soul, and you offer a lot of lessons through your personal odyssey. So I want to start because I know you've been interviewed a lot and people have asked you, why are you writing this? And your answer was, if you don't tell your story, someone else will tell your history, right? So you've written your story, which also includes a lot of history, which we can touch upon throughout the course of our evening here. But I wanted to just kind of step back and ask you, what is it that you wanted the readers to come away with? When they put the book down after having read it, what was your hope? What would they come away with? And if you could also reflect a little bit on the title, Both and, A Life in Many Worlds. Of course, those who have opened the book and read at least part of it know that Huma has lived in many worlds. But if you could just answer the kind of basic question of what do you want us to get out of this, and what is Both and?
Well, first of all, Evelyn, can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
I'm not sure I need to say anything after that introduction from Andrew, and after what you just said, Evelyn. But I have to say, I'm having a sort of an emotional moment here because I am that person who 3 weeks ago had never really spoken publicly. I preferred to be behind the scenes, invisible, with my dear friend Oscar Flores, who's here somewhere. We were in Hillary Land. We've been in Hillary Land for the last 25 years together. And walking around Chappaqua with him is like walking around with a celebrity. But to answer your question, one of the things I really wanted people to take away from the book was the importance of community. And I don't know why I can't see most of your faces. I'm just so overwhelmed by the turnout tonight, being in this beautiful space. So I'm filled with gratitude at this notion of a town that I remember driving through. I can't even remember how many years ago with the Clintons. President Clinton was still in the White House, and it just captured our hearts. Our first meal at the French restaurant. I've been to that Starbucks more times than I can count. I've shopped at Petticoat Lane. I still have some of my most favorite things from Petticoat Lane. I think I have a bag that I bought there. And so to me, this community and coming to Westchester, and particularly Chappaqua, how many times have we gone to vote at the, at this school? So thank you. I want to thank Andrew and Joan and Catherine from the library. I'm thrilled, honored to be here. Laura from Scattered Bookstore. I really want to go back to the bookstore. And I'm so thrilled to be in conversation with you, Evelyn, because I have spent the last 25 years of my life working for an extraordinary public servant, continue to work for her. And so I'm thrilled to be in conversation with you. I loved writing this book. The line you quoted about my father was one of the first lines I wrote about the book. I've spent 2 weeks on the road and doing interviews, thanks to this amazing publicity leadership that I have at Scribner. Brian is here and Paul, they're both here.
They are fantastic.
Right here in the front. I just do what they tell me. And they've done an extraordinary job shepherding this. I feel like it's been a baby I'm bringing out into the world. Like, you write all these things down and then it's out there and you don't know if how people are going to react, and the response has been extraordinary. But that was the first line. One of the very first lines I wrote was my father was told he was dying, and so he went out and he lived. And in part, as you and I have talked about, I do feel like people have been telling my story for the last 25 years. And to be able to share my truth, write my own history, take it out of somebody else's hands, I loved the process. I loved writing about the both and world. The book opens with my family. I tell the story of my parents, two immigrant, an Indian father, Pakistani mother, giving up their homes and their families, coming to this country to pursue the American dream, which they certainly found. And I was born in Kalamazoo, Michigan. I did a interview with an Irish radio host the other day, and his very first question was, is there a place in America actually called Kalamazoo, Michigan? And I assured him there was. And when I was 2, my father was diagnosed with renal failure, and he was told he had 5 to 10 years and to get his affairs in order. And I think about it, and maybe I'm having such an emotional few weeks because he was my age. I'm 46 when he was given that diagnosis. And I think about, we left 2 months later and moved to Saudi Arabia. And I had the most extraordinary childhood. My parents, every summer we traveled the world. We went to spaces and places, explored other cultures and languages and faiths. And I found actually that when I walked into the White House at 21, I was comfortable in a lot of spaces and places. It is the point of being both and. And as I pursued this career in public service, especially in 2021, it does feel as though we're living in an either or world increasingly. And I am of the both and space and place. And that is, what I believe. I can be Indian and Pakistani. I can be an American, Muslim, and also a patriot serving this country. And I've been extraordinarily privileged to live the life that I've lived. And I'm constantly honoring that, the sacrifices that my parents and grandparents made to allow me to be here with all of you. So thank you.
Well, I think people like yourself who can inhabit two worlds or multiple worlds simultaneously and know how to operate in them offer a lot to America in terms of not just what you give to society, but clearly what you've given in the course of your professional life. And we might touch upon that, but I want to make sure I cover some of the other things, some of the other personal things you talked about. Maybe I'll start with, because you mentioned the process of writing the book. In the process of writing the book, did you discover something new about yourself?
I discovered that when I sat down to write the book, I actually wasn't very confident in my writing. And I found that I both enjoyed the writing process and that people seemed to respond to it. And I think that gave me a lot of confidence. It gave me a lot of clarity. At one point, as Brian knows, the book was called Clarity. But at the time, we were there was so much paper. This book was so much longer. There was so much unclear. So the book is not called Clarity, obviously. But I did, it does force you when you write, when you write your memoir, I chose to approach this book in a way that I decided to share my full truth. Everything is in there. And I spent so much the last decade of my life, as I say, bracing for the next bad news phone call, for the next, accusation that I did something wrong or questionable. And so I'm no longer bracing. And I think there's a whole chapter in the book called Bracing. And I'm no longer in that space. And I think what I've learned about myself is that I did the thing that scared me the most, which is this, being here with all of you, speaking, occupying this space, taking your time. And I did okay. I've survived.
You're doing great. You're doing great.
Weeks.
Well, I think the other thing, again, like I said, it was when you read the book, we're bracing with you, for you, with each episode that unfolds. And as a reader, if you were following the history in real time, there's more. Yeah. And yet you write in such a raw, open way. I think the book speaks to people on multiple levels. And so I wanted to address the issue of betrayal. So, because I think that is the universal thing, really, that people can take from this book. Everyone has experienced either firsthand a betrayal or somebody close to them has experienced a betrayal. And the notion of how you deal with betrayal, we all know people who never get beyond betrayal, right? They carry that bitterness or that sadness with them, frankly, to their graves. And so you clearly have not done that. I mean, it's clear in the book, and looking at you today, you don't seem to carry it with you. And so what lessons would you, we see how you do it in the book, but what are the lessons you would give to the audience about how to move, and anyone before they read the book, about going beyond betrayal?
Well, I can only speak from my own experience, but it is true that, especially since the book has been out, I have heard from a lot of people who have experienced betrayal in their lives. It's something I share in the book, that even back in 2011, when I first learned the news about my husband, that it was such a shock to my system. And I try to, when we first started writing the book, this young woman who was doing the research with me said, I looked up all the articles about you in the last 15 years, and the most common through line about you is what is wrong with her and what is she thinking. And so I chose to put in the book exactly what it was that I was thinking, and I take people back at least in my case, I think a lot of people have a very 2021 view of my relationship with Anthony, and so I take people back. I take them back to 2001 when we met on Martha's Vineyard, meeting this really charismatic, dynamic congressman. I share how he was my first love. He was my first Valentine's date. He was the first man I was ever with, and how deeply just fulfilled I felt in this relationship. So I have a chapter in the book that opens shortly after we were married in Buckingham Palace, and I was there with Hillary on an official presidential trip, a state visit to the UK. Newly pregnant. I wasn't even 12 weeks pregnant, and I didn't just live an amazing life. I lived what I thought was the perfect life, and I pulled out a piece of stationery, and I wrote a letter to my husband and said, how is it possible for two people to be this happy and this blessed, and we have to be so grateful to God. And 4 days later, my entire life was shattered. In terms of lessons, I think for me, I didn't understand for a very long time. I was so angry and had so much bitterness and resentment. And for the first few years, I was constantly just trying to reclaim the life that I had, and learned that that's not easy to do. And in my case, it was impossible to do. But I think as you get through further, and the things I had to learn in my marriage just got worse and worse. If you've read in the paper, as you'll read in the book. And so I finally got to a point after the 2016 election where I was so low, where I felt such a sense of loneliness and isolation and anger and bitterness, and really found that it was just slowly killing me. And the only way forward was to get help, and the only way forward was to go back to my faith, and the only way forward was to try and understand. And sometimes, in our relationship, the secrets became cancers, and the only way forward was really understanding. It was really a very painful, brutal process, but I will tell you that once you get to the other side, at least for me, I can be this person that now understands. I think things are a little bit different when you have children together. That's my opinion. Anthony's always going to be the father of my child, and we have to figure out how we're going to work together to raise our son, and frankly not repeat the cycles. I really am very focused on my son having the kind of support, knowing that he's loved and supported, and that. Something I tell a lot of young women who've come to me in the last 2 weeks, it's okay to not be okay.
Yeah. I think there's a lot in the book. You talk about therapy, you talk about your therapy, Anthony's therapy. I don't want to give away everything in the book, but it's clear, and it's important for people to read right now, especially in this time of COVID, when we've seen a real uptick in terms of people needing help, and people should feel comfortable seeking it, because it is really one part of your strategy, if you will. The other part, of course, your faith.
Yeah, absolutely. I think people who say I just don't understand, I think I certainly didn't understand addiction. I didn't understand compulsive behavior. I didn't understand. It was completely unfamiliar to me. It took me a long time to, get to the space and place where I accepted. My parents raised me. One of the things that I think carried from my parents to Hillary land is this notion of having radical empathy, really trying to understand the other. And I've tried to do that in both my work life and in my personal life.
So I want to pivot a little bit. You obviously worked around the most powerful women and men in the world. And so I want to ask you a little bit about what you learned that might be of interest to the audience, young people who are going out into the world and want to become perhaps powerful themselves, whether they're men or women, and the rest of us, and just approaching and understanding how men and women operate differently and similarly in achieving power and in using their power. Because it's clear, and you make the point over and over again, that you were supported by Secretary Clinton. You were in this circle of powerful women that meant something. And I think it comes across that it was very helpful to you. And life would have been different maybe if your boss had been a man and that circle had been male. perhaps. I know you've mentioned before, sometimes you like to look back and say, what if? The sliding doors thing.
Yes.
So if I could just ask you to just riff a little bit on the differences between the men and women that you've seen in your life in terms of how they exercise power, how they gain power.
I think for me, part of it was walking into a culture in 1996 when I walked into the White House. Arguably back then, maybe it's hard to remember now, but America was the sole superpower in the world. I was working for a first lady who was, traveling the world over, championing women's rights or human rights. She'd just given her Beijing speech. Working for a president who was overseeing a very healthy economy, actively working on peace in the Middle East and other parts of the world. There was a lot happening and a lot of very exciting things happening. So for me as a 21-year-old, with a different background and perspective, there weren't a lot of people who looked like me or came from my background in the Clinton White House. Oscar is my witness. And I felt like it was the culture, and that's why I have a whole chapter in the book called Hillary Land, because I walked into a culture where different perspectives, opinions, expertise was brought to the table, and they were curious about it. I tell the stories of my boss going to a dinner on the state floor and coming back at late at night and saying, well, isn't it time for you to break your fast? Like, isn't this something you guys do after sunset? Really a curiosity and understanding, and I really appreciated that. Now, on the other hand, there was also there was a little bit of a sink or swim environment. You were kind of thrown into things, so I do share the stories in the book about my very first trip to New York with the president and first lady and the helicopter landing. And I didn't know when a president traveled that many helicopters traveled with him. And I was on the first helicopter taking off the luggage, and all of a sudden my helicopter takes off so Marine One can land with the president and Hillary. And as Marine One's landing, it lifts Hillary's hanging bag of clothes into the air and flings it out to the East River. And here I am mortified because, they're landing, and somehow managed to get the hanging bag into the van, get it dry cleaned, and she walked on stage at the United Nations building the next day having no idea that her clothes had been floating in the East River. I tell the story of how she overslept one day and nobody had told me how you wake up a first lady, and so I walked into the room and shook her really hard, and the leader of the free world woke up, and basically Secret Service was, the whole place. So there was definitely a steep learning curve, but it was an environment where it was okay to not know, it was okay to ask questions. And I write in the book that Hillary Land is a club that comes with lifetime membership, and the only entrance fee are the shared scars of doing battle in the roughest game in town. And these were women, and there were men too. Hillary Land isn't all women. That as they climbed the ladder, they didn't try to step on the fingers of the women below them. They really reached up, and I was one of the women that they supported. And so I think all throughout, when the Clintons left the White House, I said the day that I woke up, I made a promise to myself. The day I woke up and did not want to get on Metro North and come to Chappaqua, because my daily commute was the city to Chappaqua every day while she was in the Senate, was the day I was going to give notice. And that was 25 years ago. And it says so much to me about who she is as a leader that, and I actually haven't had this conversation with anyone else, Evelyn, maybe because I'm in conversation with you, but one of the things that I think is so unique about Hillary is that she is not scared of other women's power. I think she really does believe that everyone has a seat at the table, man or woman. She's not, and I'm not, I think that's a very special characteristic to have. And she often sees more in you than you see in yourself. I tell a story in the book that during the 2016 campaign, she was running late for an event in Colorado. And as we're driving, she casually turns to me in the car and says, oh, by the way, you may have to do one of these speeches for me. And as I've made clear, I'm terrified of public speaking. So I'm next to her, like praying that the day, 24 hours becomes 26 so that she has, but she believed I could do it. She knew I could do it. And to have somebody who has that faith in you, and then going back to a time when we worked closely together at the State Department, and I had a fairly senior job at State. I was the Deputy Chief of Staff for operations, and in part I was responsible for planning all the Secretary of State's trips. And Cheryl Mills, who is our chief of staff, calls me into her office and says, I'm looking at all these meetings, and you put all the men into these meetings. I see one of our colleagues from state right here. I'm not going to embarrass him. Bob's sitting right there. But this notion of why do you not put yourself in these meetings? And I didn't think I was qualified to be in those meetings. And Cheryl looks at me and says, you are a senior staff person in this office. You have had a seat at the table for a long time in the inside world. You need to occupy it in the outside world. And so I think to have that kind of push and support from women leaders, and that is a culture that certainly Hillary Clinton follows, I think is important in every sector and environment. I've just been lucky to be in a space and place. And I say that about the men I work for too. I mean, President Clinton, and I had the honor of serving President Obama too. In the entire book, I try not to tell stories about any of these people, John McCain, Lindsey Graham, any of them. I just try to show you what it's like. I take you onto Air Force One with us. I take you to Egypt, where we're having conversations about what she's going to do before she goes to Tahrir Square. It's trying to reveal just their humanity, just their leadership qualities by sharing what it was like being in spaces and places as history was being made.
Yeah, it is really interesting just to watch how you made your way, up through the ranks. And then just to watch how some of the men did it, it was just interesting. But
Yeah.
I think you definitely benefited from the support. Do you have any lessons, kind of advice you would give to young people today?
Well, for me, I always say young people who ask me, and some of my favorite events in the last 3 weeks have been at colleges and universities. And they always ask me, how did you do that? How did you get to this amazing job? And I actually didn't have a secret formula. I mean, I was prepared to outwork anybody. And it is just putting in the work and finding work that you love doing. And for me, that came very early at 21. I mean, I did not plan to be in politics. I wanted to be Christiane Amanpour. That's who I saw on TV when I was living in Saudi Arabia. And Operation Desert Storm was underway. And all of a sudden, this figure appears on TV. And somehow, Paul and Brian figured out how to get me on an interview with Christiane Amanpour, which was amazing 2 weeks ago. I didn't become Christiane, but to see something, made it possible for me. It's one of the many reasons I wrote the book, which is maybe if you see something in someone, you think it's, possible for yourself. The second thing I tell young people is what my father told me when I was little, and I did not follow his advice. Was that a good life is a balanced life. And I did not have a balanced life. In fact, it was Hillary who told me to stop and, find some balance in your life. And I write about that experience in the book, the moment she and I had when she said, you have to rebalance and focus on your personal life and your family, and work should come second. And so I tell all young people to try to find balance.
So I want to also ask you about some foreign policy questions, but before I do that, since we're kind of on the topic of powerful women, what advice would you give, having gone through the gamut with Secretary Clinton on the presidential campaign trail twice now, what advice would you give to the next woman who tries to run for president or is one of the major party candidates for president?
Evelyn, it is one of the reasons I write in detail in the book about all of these moments that Hillary first, when she ran for the Senate, the U.S. Senate, when she was First Lady in 2000, and then the 2008 presidential election and the 2016 presidential election. And again, I try to show the stories of how I saw in real time what women were up against, certainly in electoral politics. And you know this firsthand, frankly, in some ways better than me, because you've been in the game yourself. But in 2000, and I don't know how many of you in the room remember, when then Congressman Rick Lazio, at a debate, marches over to her podium holding up a sheet of paper, insisting that she sign it. And the rest of us are backstage having no idea if this is a good thing or a bad thing, but presuming it's really bad because it made him look strong, and maybe does she look weak. Long story short, it had the exact opposite effect. She won that election, and then she won re-election with resoundingly, which I think is still one of the most astonishing, things that she's done that she doesn't get enough credit for. That re-election in 2006 to the Senate in New York was extraordinary. But then in 2008, I went back after I wrote the first draft of this book, and my editor, Nan Graham, asked me to go back and write more about 2008, because I think a lot of young people, not a lot, but some young people forget that Hillary ran for president in 2008. And I have this, I have a little chip on my shoulder about 2008 because she made history for the women and, girls in this country forever when she won that primary in New Hampshire and then went on to win many, many more primaries and caucuses. But I make the argument in my book that I think we did not know how to deal with sexist comments towards women in 2008. So every time somebody said her jacket wasn't particularly attractive or her laugh was annoying, or when Tucker Carlson said things like, when she comes on TV, I involuntarily cross my legs, we all giggled. We didn't know how to handle it. And even that included those of us in the game. We just assumed this was the price you paid to be in the game. And then by the time we got to 2016, it's why I share half a chapter with how ridiculous the feedback we constantly got and how inconsistent it was. So people saying her jackets should be longer, her jackets should be shorter, I don't like her hair this way. Why do you have her in suits? She needs to be more approachable. Put her in t-shirts. Put her in t-shirts, and they say she needs to look presidential. Don't make her look, like too casual. Okay. And then I share the story of a Hollywood director who called me and said, I have advice. I want to, give her some media training. And I said, and Evelyn, I'm curious if you've ever had this. I said, well, give me some ideas, models of who you want Hillary to be like. And he said, yes, her husband. Well, great, excellent, agreed. He's an amazing communicator. Anybody else? Barack Obama. Okay, also excellent, both men, communicators of their generations, both men. Do you have any women examples? And he couldn't think of anybody in that moment. He couldn't think of anybody. And in part, the summary that I make is just because she is the model. She was the precedent. And we could never get it right. And I think my final straw was when a media strategist told me that he had an idea, because she always looked angry when she was giving speeches and so serious. And so his suggestion was that we put a picture of her grandchild on the podium whenever she was going to give a speech. And so that way, when she stood at the podium, she would look at something that made her happy. And so she would look happy. And I would think, how many people were giving Donald Trump, feedback like that? Nobody. It was really, really hard. And now fast forward to, frankly, what you had to go through and what our current vice president has to go through. It's really hard in politics, but I would also argue it's just really hard for women generally in executive positions of leadership. And that's whether it's conscious or subconscious.
It reminds me of that advice, that advice that men always give, smile more.
So, right.
You're not going to smile when you're talking about weapons of
Right.
mass destruction,
Right,
in the
right.
hands of North Korean madman or unemployment. And full disclosure, I was in New Hampshire in 2008 and proud
Oh, really?
that
Really?
she
We haven't
won.
had this conversation, really? Oh, that was an
it
amazing
volunteer.
night.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it was. So I want to ask you about diplomacy before I get to foreign policy. Just one other question, and I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit to dig for stories, because you saw a lot,
Yeah.
and I'm sure it didn't make it into the book, all the stories, of
lot of
people
story for cut.
who Secretary Clinton interacted with, and really you can pick as First Lady or as Secretary of State, but I would focus more on the diplomatic with foreign interlocutors. There must have been times when there were people who were particularly disarming in a good way, so they made a real connection with her, they did something or said something that actually helped them vis-a-vis the United States, really, because of course what are they doing when they're talking to the Secretary of State or the First Lady? They're trying to achieve for their country some sort of objective. But conversely, there may have been others who made big mistakes, and it hurt them in terms of advancing their country's cause because they said the wrong thing or did the wrong thing. Do you have any lessons that we can pass along to Tony Blinken and his team, and maybe to the people meeting with Tony Blinken today and in subsequent days?
Well, in many ways we are, at least in terms of our engagement with the world, I would argue, in a very similar position we were in 2009. After 8 years where a war was started, where we had the chaos and the increasingly, and I write in the book about the increasingly deteriorating circumstances situation in both Iraq and Afghanistan. So in 2009, when Hillary Clinton stepped on that plane to travel around the world, everywhere she landed, for the most part, was a welcome. She was a welcome sight. She was, greeted and treated like a rock star. She was doing both. She always had, and I haven't had an opportunity to really talk about this in many of my conversations, but she always had very clear missions everywhere she went. So we knew we had to do the bilateral stuff. We knew we'd be sitting in these long meetings where, you'd have these very formal conversations along the lines of, we are here to talk and discuss our mutual cooperation, like all this fancy talk that really you're not sure what any of it means, but you have to do it for diplomacy. She would also try and see people, and as much as possible see, average citizens, which was not, typical for most secretaries of state. And she did as much media as she could, and she also tried to lift up civil society. And in places like Russia, for example, that was really hard. I tell a story. There are so many stories in the book that got cut, but I did think that one of the really amazing qualities that Hillary had is because she is such an old hand in some ways in diplomacy, that she had a very good way of disarming her hosts, even when she was needed to have a difficult conversation. I remember we landed in Europe once, and the minute the head of state, to be unnamed, sees her, he starts whispering to her aides, and finally she sits down, and she's, Hillary's just like, what's going on? And he says, well, my staff has told me that if you have your hair in a ponytail, you're angry. And I noticed your hair is in a ponytail. And Hillary's like, these crazy rumors that would be started. Or I share the story in the book, the very first trip she did with President Obama in April of 2009. We were traveling to Germany for the G20, which Biden just went to. And she hadn't taken a vacation in a really long time, and I had convinced her to get a massage. We had 2 hours off at this hotel in Baden-Baden. And she never takes vacations, let alone massages. And I said, no, go. It's fine. You have plenty of time. Well, it turns out we had a typo on the schedule, and we did not have 90 minutes off. We had 30 minutes off. So after 15 minutes, she's on this massage table. I run back downstairs. I pound on the door, and I say, oh, my God, we have to go. Because imagine if we were late for Angela Merkel and Barack Obama, first trip ever. It would look like a real slight. It was kind of a contentious primary. And I knock on the door, and she's so delirious. She says, oh, my God, that hour went by so quickly. I said, yes, it did. And she walks out, and her mascara's leaking. Her hair is sticking straight up. And we ran, and we made it. I mean, part of diplomacy is the hysteria of just trying to, but it's not hysteria, it's really making connections. It's like landing in Saudi Arabia. And the first thing she said to the king, who did not speak English, King Abdullah, she turns to him and say, I hear the foreign minister hates camels. And the king says, I love camels. I mean, it's just bringing out this kind of connection to, in the end, get what you want. Because a lot of times when we were landing in countries, you are asking them for things they may not necessarily want to agree upon. And so it's finding those ways and places to compromise, common ground. A lot of times we were giving money, or there were deliverables, or you were trying to have what you might remember very well, strategic dialogues with countries. But the point being, it's important to talk to, to our partners. We are living in a both-and world, not in an isolationist world. And Tony Blinken, I will say, I mean, look, it is hard for me to be on the outside because I've been on the inside for so long. You can relate. Tony Blinken was the cool national security staffer, like dating the prettiest girl in the First Lady's office, Evan Ryan. Like, they were kind of the it couple in the Clinton White House. And so I share that story to say I've known him for a really long time. I've been in plenty of meetings with him, as I have been with Ron Klain and Jake Sullivan and all the people, Liz Sherwood Randall, who have places in this government. So I know they're trying to do the right thing. I know there are patriots. I know they were handed a very, very tough set of issues walking in. I mean, this bill that was just passed is a big thing. I know it's easy for us to focus on the disarray between the two parties, and that certainly exists, but they're trying to do some really big, important things.
Yeah, I'm really glad that you mentioned Saudi Arabia because there's a lot of Saudi Arabia in your book, and you yourself, you talk. There's so many instances where you describe how you're a personal bridge between the United States and some other country.
Yeah.
Personally, you're a bridge between the United States and Pakistan and India and Saudi Arabia and really the Middle East and many countries. You were the bridge to the point where they accidentally tried to offer you a seat on their side. The Saudis did.
Right.
So I'm tempted I'm not tempted, I'm going to actually do it. I want to ask you about Saudi Arabia because I think you might be the only person in this room, maybe even in Chappaqua, who's actually lived there. Though you are American and you were born here, you were also raised in Saudi Arabia before you came back and lived as an adult in the United States, went to college and lived as an adult. So you know Saudi Arabia very well, and as a woman, you know Saudi Arabia very well. And I wonder if you could reflect a little bit about the prospects for reform in Saudi Arabia. In the United States, we know a little bit about it. We know that the Crown Prince ostensibly wants some more reform. Of course, we know about Saudi women pushing for reform and ending up imprisoned and in exile or in house arrest. Can you talk to us a little bit about what we should expect or what you expect?
So I do. I actually open the scene. The book opens with a scene of me being 3 years old and getting lost in the old city in Jeddah. And we moved to this country. It was supposed to be a 1-year sabbatical back in the late 70s. And the region, even then, was convulsing. I mean, it was it was a few years after the very popular King Faisal was assassinated, actually by his nephew. You had the Israel-Egypt war, turning into thankfully a resolution. I mean, there was a lot happening, whether it was Libya or Lebanon. Lebanon was on the tail end of being, back in the 60s. Anyone familiar with that part of the world remembers Lebanon as the Paris of the Middle East. But because of this influx of oil money and all this great infrastructure that the Saudi government then had invested in, there were institutions like this brand new private university that my parents were academics. My father was a political scientist, my mother a sociologist. They had this great opportunity. I mean, we haven't had a chance to talk about this, but I really, my grandmother, 110 years ago, had to fight to be educated in India. Girls in her community, and certainly in that time, did not go to school. And she demanded to go to school. And it's why I opened the story with the matriarchs in my family, and I close with the matriarchs in my family, because every one of those, and so by the way, she did convince her parents to send her to school, but because it was so shameful for a girl to be seen leaving the house back then in the early 1900s, she had to go from the rear of the house in a covered ox cart to school every day. And I think about that demand that she made. Every time I landed in a Macedonian refugee camp and met with Kosovar Muslim women, when I went to Baghdad and met with Iraqi women at the table, and they would reach over to me and say to me in Arabic, "Do you know what it's like? Do you understand what I mean?" And the reality is I didn't, because here I was landing with a former first lady, a sitting senator, often traveling with John McCain, constantly reminded of the faith, the luck, the hard work, but the aspirations of my, the people who came before me. For us, it's why I write about my personal experience in Saudi Arabia, because it really became a community, the world we lived in. There was a lot of support. We call it in the Muslim world the Ummah, which is the community. It's what I was reflecting upon when I walked in here, feeling a very sense of community. You never felt alone. It's a social responsibility to attend somebody's wedding, a funeral. I share the story in the book that when my father did receive a kidney and had to rush to the United States for his transplant, that a Saudi family friend, one of our dear friends, called and said to my mother that us 3 little girls should move into their house. And we were so scared of change, so scared of what was happening with my father, that my mother makes up this excuse and says, no, the girls aren't going to move in with you. They have exams coming up, and so they need their desks and their bookcases. And so the next morning, there's a knock on our door, and there's a man from a moving company saying, "I'm here to move some desks and bookcases." And basically and we did. They moved our furniture into their house. There was always a sense of you're not alone, like it's going to be okay. And so that's the Saudi Arabia I connected to. I also do write about this notion that everywhere we went, we did travel as Americans, this sense of identity that we had. And to me, America did not just represent, because my father and mother knew that they couldn't, they came from two countries that were at war and are arguably still at war, India and Pakistan. There are people who don't believe you can be both Indian and Pakistani, which I am. So for them, our faith was important. It's one of the reasons we moved to Saudi Arabia, was so they could teach us about our faith, but also this notion that your identity is an American identity. And everywhere I landed in the world, and I write in the book, whether it was Vienna or Bangkok, or Montreal, I would wake up in the middle of the night, and every time we were wheels down, I would turn to my mother and say, "Is it America yet?" I don't know that I would have reflected on my time there growing up with such sort of rose-colored view. If I didn't know that freedom was not a flight away, it was. We came here, home all the time. I try to be fair about, telling people what they should want versus encouraging what they want. So I think as women are asking for, more reform and more rights, more education, I was actually home in July, and it is stunning. I mean, when I was living there, I had to be covered. Now you don't have to be. It's slow. Progress is slow. It's different from anything you've experienced here, but I am constantly trying to understand what it is like to be in those, in those countries and those places.
So you mentioned your faith, and earlier you mentioned the cards that Secretary Blinken and President Biden were dealt, and some of those cards were foreign policy cards. Specifically, I'm thinking now of Afghanistan. I wonder if you could reflect a little bit, based on your personal experience, on the debate that often occurs, and it's often emotional, not very intellectual, about whether a place like Afghanistan could become a democracy, and did the United States expect too much? Do you have any thoughts? I mean, it may be too early to really have any fully formed thoughts about the future of Afghanistan, but do you have any thoughts about what the U.S. tried to do in Afghanistan and what we can expect going forward?
Well, I do believe that there are certain things that had Hillary won in 2016 would not have happened, and certainly the way we left Afghanistan would not have happened. I also like to remind, because several of my Republican friends did call me this summer as the United States was preparing to leave, sort of wagging their fingers, and I like to remind them that the Biden administration did not inherit a plan; they inherited a deadline. They had to be out by this date. This was negotiated by Mike Pompeo. And I think that is an important context for people to remember. Having said that, I think this administration has been very forthright in saying they did not anticipate the Taliban regaining control, certainly that quickly. They thought they had more time to do it. But to me, personally, my personal opinion is I don't think we as America can go in and tell countries about the kind of government they should be running and how. I think we are going to be partners just because of our position in the world. That is, we have that responsibility. We have that responsibility gene. It's the principles upon which this country was founded. But we do have to allow for leaders in that country, in whichever country, to decide what it is. Afghanistan, it's very hard for me to talk about it without being affected, because I am one of those people who established enough relationships with women leaders in Afghanistan, and obviously thanks to Hillary, and was part of a large group of NGOs that did try to help evacuate women. And I will tell you, to wake up from emails and WhatsApp messages from women sending pictures of their babies wrapped in blankets saying, "Are you going to leave us here to die?" is a very hard message to respond to. And so for me, it is part of that challenge of being on the outside versus the inside. It's not that I don't think that they're trying to do the right thing on the inside. The challenges are complex, but it is personally, it's very, very painful.
Yeah, I can certainly relate. I have in my Signal, messages from Afghans who are still trapped.
Yeah.
So we're coming up upon the hour. I would like to finish.
How did this go by so quickly?
I know. It's been great. I would like to finish by bringing you back to where we started with your story. You, as you say very eloquently, we're kind of behind the scenes always. Now you've told your story. You have established yourself as somebody who has something to say and something to contribute very publicly. What's next?
Well, my very first morning show interview, I completely messed up because I had said I had stolen Shonda Rhimes' approach to her year when she wrote her memoir, and she said it was her year of saying yes. So I thought it was brilliant. I love Shonda. I was also going to say this is my year of saying yes. So of course the first question I get asked is, are you going to run for office? And I said yes, but I didn't mean to say yes. So of course it was yes, but I don't know. I mean, I'm proud to add author to my list. To my resume. So who knows, maybe I'll write some more. But I'm kind of just enjoying this moment. It's been really very affirming. And I feel as though I'm making so many connections with people in the world. And so I'm going to allow opportunities to come to me. And maybe I'll still become Christiane Amanpour. I don't know. But I don't know, and I think it's okay to know. I'm somebody who's like had so much control over so much of her life for so long. I think I'm okay with letting go a little bit.
You should take your time and savor this moment. It's one of the lessons of the book. Just slow down, balance.
Right, it is.
Enjoy what you have. Thank you so much, Huma, for taking the time to write this book, to share this with all of us. And for those of you who don't have the book yet, as you heard, Scattered Books is here. They are happy to sell one to you. And Huma will also be available to sign the books. Thank you again so much for making the time to come back to Chappaqua. Please come back again.
Thank you, Evelyn. I've so enjoyed this conversation. And thank you to all of you. Thank you.